Right.
So we see your slide.
Whoop,
Here we
whoop.
go.
Hold on. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Has a life of its own. All right. So you
Perfect.
can see my slides. That's good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about food security and remote sensing and how we can engage with the broader humanitarian community and how we can use satellite remote sensing to inform decision making at the national and international level. So whereas the previous talk was more about agriculture in the United States and the individual farmers, here I'm going to talk about the concepts of food security, how remote sensing is used within each pillar, the availability, access, and utilization, which are the three pillars of food security, and how we use satellite data within each one of those. So to start right out, food security, it exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. This is the official 1996 World Food Summit definition, updated in 2012. So there's a number of aspects of this. The current trends in food security, if you look at the World Food Program State of Food Security and Nutrition, um, uh, document, and we can see that in Africa, the percent of the population who is food insecure is still rising from 2015 through 2024, gone from around 45 to 60%. Now, this includes severe food insecurity and moderate food insecurity as assessed by the World Food Program. In Asia, the food insecurity has declined during this period. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's also declined. And I'd like to point out, in the United States and Europe, we're not perfect either. So there's a very small percentage of severe food insecurity, people who are unhoused, who are poor, who have struggled to buy sufficient food for their families. And then there's a smaller proportion, that those orange bands, which are moderately food insecure, which means they are either food insecure part of the year or only one meal a day, or otherwise it's fairly moderate. If you look at the places where we have projected population growth, hold on. These are exactly the same places where we have food insecurity. So that this is a map shows where the net reproduction rate will fall below the replacement level. And so there's a significant population decline, which has already begun. So in the Northern Hemisphere, Europe, Russia, China, Australia, United States, and Canada, we are already below total fertility rate of 1.5 or 2. And so we're below the total fertility rate of 2. United States is doing slightly better because we have immigrants. But this will have significant replacement, uh, significant issues with food security, because as the amount of population, the older people grows and the younger people declines, the way we support social safety nets is going to decline, is going to really have to change. In Africa, we have a growing population, but that is also where we have already a lot of food security challenges. Before I get to this, one thing I would say about population growth is that this is really an active area of research. It is these projections change all the time. So it is really hard, you might think population growth, we know. No, it's actually really, really challenging. Lots of new, interesting research going on. So you cannot just think it's one thing. You have to keep looking. So there are three primary pillars of food security. We have availability, access, utilization, and the stability of these three. Availability looks at production of food, distribution, and exchange, otherwise known as trade. And we can use satellite data to look at regional land cover, weather events, observations of cropped area and cropped health. And this is what Allison was talking about in the previous session and why remote sensing is so critical to look at the actual weather and drought flood impacts. Access, we have prices, trade, household resources, wealth. This is whether or not the food that is actually where you live is affordable to you, whether or not that food is allocated to you within your household, and also whether or not the food you can buy is what you prefer to eat. So like if there's only meat available and you happen to be a vegetarian, you're not exactly able to access food, even if there's piles of affordable food that other people could eat. And then finally, utilization. Utilization is essentially individual nutrition outcomes, food safety, and the social value of food. And here is where geographic information about access to healthcare, food, and your status. And I will give some examples of each of these in the next few slides. So we're going to start with food availability. So food availability at the global scale, we produce just huge amounts of food, but the likely demand for food will double within the next 25 and 50 years. And the type and nutritional quality of the food demanded will change. This is with the same amount of consumption for the same number for the people who make money. This is essentially growth of the middle class, rising, like the Indians and the Chinese eating more hamburgers and more food, which is more sort of westernization of their diets. So this is going to be a challenge at the global scale. And if you look at statistics about the availability by category, we can see that all of these categories of food without minus the sugar crops are all still growing. And the source of the demand for these different categories of food is different. So these orange bars here are due to simply population growth. So there's going to be more people eating wheat and rice and corn and other cereals. And then in 2023 to 2032, some of the demand for cereals is going to be due to population, due per capita food demand growth, which otherwise known as there are more people with money who can buy pork, can buy rice, right? And so the demand for cereals will remain flat despite the fact that the number of people is going to be relatively lower in some of these regions by 2023 to 32. Similarly for dairy, population growth is going down, but the demand for food because of increased wealth is about the same. Fish is going to decline. This is merely due to the fact that we are degrading our aquatic resources. Meat is projected to go down slightly. Sugar crops is going to continue to be increased, and this is a blip. I'm not quite sure what's driving that one. And then decline in oils. Oops, excuse me. Whoop. Oh, my goodness. to use my mouse better. Apologies. So satellite data products are quite widespread in the use to look at food security and all of these data products. On the bottom is a set of slides from the Food and Agriculture Organization showing different kinds of data products, MODIS, Landsat, Sentinel, rainfall data products, temperature, and crop models. And there's more satellite data available now than ever before. And we really do need those data products. Globally, moisture conditions will continue to affect food production. This figure shows maize impacts, so the likely occurrences of impacts across all the different locations that grow maize is between 10 and 15%. For main season, it's relatively lower. For second season, rice are those green bars that show the likely impact of sort of floods and droughts on rice. Soybean is between 5 and 15% with a big scatter. Wheat is a big one, particularly winter wheat is significantly affected by dry early or late in the season. Similarly, temperature anomalies will continue to affect production. This is far less clear due to the difficulty of extracting temperature anomalies from moisture anomalies in the same places. And so you can see that shift when we get out of optimal temperatures to temperatures which are outside the optimal, we can have significant impacts. Exactly where this will land, we will only know in the coming decades due to the fact that we have multiple things happening. Not only is the moisture rainfall conditions changing, but also the varieties, the agricultural technologies. So a lot of people are working really hard to make sure that we modify the primary wheat, maize, rice, and soy crops to withstand higher temperatures. And then I'm going to give a few slides now regarding how we can map cropped area through time. So here is an example of a cropped area map for Zimbabwe. And here what we've done is we've mapped all of the pixels, the areas within Zimbabwe for 2021 that have been cultivated for maize. And we did this during the season. And then we identified the fields which were very large. So you can see here example of the pivot irrigation and other large areas of commercial crops which have been cultivated within Zimbabwe. And then when we take each one of those fields, we can see where the fields are healthy because they fall within our expected green up and senescence, and places where the fields are not as healthy, where the actual vegetation curve, which is that line there, falls outside of the band of expected. And so by looking at every single field across all of Zimbabwe, we're able to calculate the maize and the wheat production throughout the country within the season when it's being cultivated. So this regional sort of in-season assistance really will help us understand how we can get early action to help the government of Zimbabwe and other countries who work on total production to understand when we need to import and when we need to export, and to make sure that they are prepared for total food deficit or surpluses in their countries. Okay, So this was also an example that shows how boundaries that Allison mentioned very briefly can be used within a food security system. And which is going to be a big area of production in the future. So these last two slides on availability, we have productivity prediction, where we apply the we basically are taking, this is a 6th grade assessment of fields within Mato Grosso. We created boundaries for 140,000 fields across Mato Grosso. And then we estimated the productivity for the current season, the hot, wet, and dry scenarios. And here's a zoom in. And basically, the objective here is to find the fields that are likely to be affected by weather-related shocks in the coming season. So we have 2024 current, and then in 2025, will those fields be able to cope with dry conditions, with hotter than average or wetter than average? And then what is the overall likely impact for total production, global availability? You can see where both pixel level and field scale assessments can be used to have really unprecedented insight into total food availability across the global food system. Okay, so now we're going to move on. Oops, one more thing to say, I should say. I'm sorry. So we really, and I think Allison mentioned this about how few people actually use digital agronomy and remote sensing technologies. This is a McKinsey report from 2024, where it is shown that digital agronomy is used in some ways in the United States and in the EU and Brazil, but places like India, who really need it, have very little use of the digital agronomy tools. Similar with precision hardware, remote sensing technologies there in the middle, right here, farm management software, etc. Oh, excuse me. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our second pillar of remote sensing, which is access to food. So we're going to assume that food is available where you're located. And basically, the food security community measures food access via prices. Consumers have obviously fundamental constraints on dietary choice and diversity. Food affordability is at the heart of access. If food is too expensive, it's not accessible. And I know all of you, like me, at some point or another, have been not being able to afford the groceries that I wanted. When I'm at the store, I have to make choices between the broccoli and the beans, right? And so food prices are a critical parameter of food security because they allow for rapid evaluation of problems of, frankly, availability. When supplies are low and no one brings in additional food, the prices will rise. It also lets us evaluate access to food. When prices rise quickly, but income doesn't change, consumption will drop due to lack of money. And then finally, stability of food security. Rapid changes in access can result in severe transient food insecurity. So here's an example of proportion of consumer expenditure spent on food. And this was a couple years ago before inflation really got going. So in the United States and in Australia, Canada and Australia, we really have very inexpensive food globally. We are at the bottom of proportion of food purchased. And note, this is only in home, at home. This does not count food purchases at restaurants, alcohol, and tobacco. So Europe has around 20, between 10 and 20% of the cost of food. And then Eastern Europe is between 20 and 30%, and there are places in Africa, which is over 50% of the income made every year is spent on food. And you can imagine if food prices double, there's really nowhere to go, right? So, and there's been significant efforts to document climate impacts on food prices. Here's a plot from the World Food Program showing a whole set of shocks that have affected local prices in each of these markets. So for example, in India, prices increased between 89 and 81% in 2024 after a big heat wave. South Korea, cabbage prices went through the roof. In Japan, rice prices are almost 50% higher in 2024 than previous year due to a heat wave. Ethiopia prices are 40% higher following the 22 drought. And there's a big suite. Even in California, Arizona, vegetable prices are 80% higher in the United States after Western droughts. So, and we also find that seasonality is still an important driver. In many markets where we have very weak market systems, such as in West Africa, the prices go way up during the hungry season right before harvest and then fall after harvest due to that supply and demand and the access to food and frankly consumption in general just falls during periods of higher prices. And this, although that previous work was quite old, this is still true today. Here I'm showing prices from 2024 and 2025. We can see that big increases and the seasonality, particularly for in Niger, which has extremely weak food price analysis. Right. Okay. So this seasonality continues to affect food security. And we can see here that the staple food price index is continues to be affected by changes from the annual average of local prices. And essentially people really stop consuming food when they have very big changes in availability. So, and finally, this seasonality and seasonality metric is widespread. So it's not just in Africa, it is also in South America, in Central America, and in Asia, where medium or high seasonality will affect food insecurity. And this seasonality is affected by weather shocks. The study that I did with a colleague from the World Bank in 2013 showed that 20% of 554 commodity location pairs were affected by local weather shocks compared to only 9% by international price drivers. Okay, finally on to utilization. Now here is where we're going to talk about how we know that a place is food insecure. So utilization is related to individual nutrition status. And as you can imagine, almost everywhere around the world, it's really hard to figure out what people are eating. If you do these nutrition surveys, the 24-hour recall, people inevitably say, oh yes, I had vegetables and fruit, of course. Whereas in fact, they aren't actually having vegetables and fruit. It's so easy to have your aspirational self as opposed to the reality. So to estimate actual impact of food security on human health, many studies focus on children and their short-term malnutrition or wasting, which is basically where a child is thinner than they should be, and long-term malnutrition, which is stunting, where they are both thinner and shorter than they should be for their age to measure nutrition outcomes. This is really effective because, as you might imagine, children are the last ones who will not eat food. And also these kinds of anthropometrics, which is where you actually weigh the kid, does not require any recall or discussion. It is as far as anything, the most certain data that there is about the overall nutrition status of a community. So we bring that satellite data together with these nutrition data sets over seasons and decades, and in order to understand what the impact of the environmental conditions, weather and vegetation through time, to understand nutritional outcomes. So another reason why we focus on child health instead of adult health is that it is really important that we have, in the first 1,000 days, sufficient amount of food for children. There are severe consequences for child's physical, cognitive, and behavioral development, and addressing these needs is really critical to break the cycle of poverty and poor health. Another thing I would say here, as the mother of 2 children, feeding a toddler is humongously difficult, even when you have unlimited resources to feed them. Either they're crying because they're hungry, or they're crying because they don't want to eat, or something. It's really, really challenging. So having information on outcomes is really important. So luckily, there is a data set which is funded by the US government and each of the countries you see here. The Demographic and Health Survey Data Program provides these observations of childhood nutrition, which are temporally explicit. In that data set, you get exactly when the survey was conducted with that household, the date in which the household was conducted, as well as a latitude longitude point where the survey was conducted. The closest we get these centroids. So you can see the data is extremely extensive, and there's a wide variety of agroecological zones and development levels, and all sorts of other information. So I'm going to give you an example of 2 different projects that I worked on. One is this one, which shows which is a study on low birth weight, where the children in each of these clusters, these are the clusters I mentioned before, which is a number of households around each of these latitude longitude points, were interrogated and had a whole set of survey. This is a half-day survey. And this particular study went across 19 countries for 36 surveys from 1986 to 2010. And it is combined with the livelihood zone type, which is from the Famine Early Warning System Network. The results show that temperature, precipitation, and birth weight have relationships. There's a positive relationship between birth weight and growing season rainfall, which means that the wetter it is, the larger the babies, and a negative relationship between birth weight and hot days, which means that the hotter it is, the lower the birth weight. 2 important conclusions from this: that increasing temperatures and decreasing precipitation is likely to have an impact, although a small impact, on birth weight outcomes. And second, that the impact of climate change on birth weight will really depend on where the woman lives, mediating factors such as income, education, and available electricity. And I have this figure here, which shows that the percent change in birth weight if you have temperature increases or declines in precipitation, temperatures increase and declines in precipitation, and finally, increase in education and electricity with temperature increase and precipitation decrease. What I conclude from these results are that it is going to be really easy for the climate to overwhelm any gains that we've had on child nutrition outcomes. So all the efforts that we've done to increase maternal and childhood education and improve access to electricity are easily overwhelmed by the rapid and massive changes in the climate. That is what the evidence shows. So the second study is more about how smallholder food security varies across rainfall conditions. And here we are using a different set of surveys, not the demographic and health survey, but the one from the CGIAR, the CG system, the CCAFS program, during a baseline survey in 2010 to 2012. And the data set was numbers of months food insecure for the information. And you can see again, it's over a wide range of communities. Let's see. And so what we could show here, and I'm just presenting a brief summary, is that there's a lot of benefit to having agricultural technology. To go back to one of my earlier points, is if you have access to certified seed, fertilizer, manure, pesticide, medicine, livestock, irrigation, you can reduce the amount of food insecurity. Here, the dark bands are significant results, and the dark blue bands are with this factor versus compared to communities that did not have access to, did not have access to these inputs. So for example, fertilizer, if you had access to the fertilizer, you were only food insecure in these communities for 3 months of the year. If you did not have access, it would be 4 months of the year. Similarly, over on the right, financial resources, having access to loans, gifts, and other businesses reduced the amount of food insecurity you had. Finally, participation in groups was preferential for people who were more food insecure than those who were not. Okay, so the total conclusions of this paper are that we found reduced odds of food insecurity associated with use of agricultural inputs, ownership of livestock, water use efficiency, financial services. However, in drier than average locations, the households who are in the drier than average locations, financial services were really critical. And as we all know, if we have information about how likely a particular field and its associated household is to be resilient to drier or wetter conditions, then we can design financial services which are able to result in more loans and better adoption of inputs. To go back to those slides that I was showing you in Mato Grosso. I can go back to them at the end of this. But then finally, only the use of fertilizer consistently results in reduced odds regardless of rainfall. Okay, so to conclude, environmental conditions affect global, regional, and local food security by disrupting availability, decreasing access, and making utilization more difficult. And clearly, the risks are greater for the poorest and those in the tropics, but there's so much opportunity for better use of satellite data and to continue investments in increased resilience. And that is all I have.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you so much. I will let the audience share their questions or inquiry if in the chat or in the Q&A section. While we are waiting for Mario to get ready, we're expecting him to. So we will start around like in 10 minutes with Mario, but meanwhile, if you have any questions,
I've overwhelmed everyone. Oops. Gosh.
Molly, you were going to show back the work you the Mato Grosso
Oh, yes.
thing, so maybe this is the time to do so.
Right. So I meant this thing. As you recall, the point here was that we can show by looking at the response of a particular field to dry, hot, and wet conditions over the past, we can then estimate the likely impact of those conditions in the future, given fairly static land ownership and use of and their cultivation practices. So we can pick out the places that have poor, organic matter management or are doing poorly for other reasons that are at the bottom of the hill or the top of a hill and that are more vulnerable to very wet or very dry conditions. So you can see how this would easily fit into a agricultural insurance or loan program where the farmers who are more resilient or have better practices can be given access to additional inputs. So that's
Molly,
what I meant.
yeah, we have some questions in the chat.
Oh, good. Excellent.
So we can go and
Okay, right. Okay, do you know if research satellites are connected to Starlink?
hmm.
I have no idea. Waleed will have to answer that question. Basically, the data is so big, I would be extremely scared to bring data down via Starlink. So even across Africa, if you aren't connected to an undersea cable, really hard to get satellite data down in a timely manner. So Starlink, as you might all know, is the communication satellite, allowing you to replace your Wi-Fi. So the second, what are your thoughts on remote sensing applications to the more economic, human-sided aspects of food security? Yes. So the answer is no. I do not think satellite data or very high resolution imagery will ever replace in situ surveys because it's really hard to diagnose what people are doing from optical reflectance information. The reason for that is that the world is so complex. It's extremely challenging to have to transform remote sensing into information as it is. However, within sixth grade, we have found that we do not need to talk with every single, we don't need hundreds of thousands of data points as we did 10, 20 years ago. we have so much satellite data and we have so much experience, we're really much better able to focus the survey or the in situ talking to the people part to the place of our classification or our analysis that performs poorly. And in places where it's really obvious, really well characterized, we don't need to talk with people. So we sort of have this, we, instead of talking with a representative sample, we gather data in places that have a lot more confusion on the biophysical side than in the social side. Okay, next question. Is there any organization for supporting food sovereignty? All right, this is a really great question. So there are not that many places supporting food sovereignty, but food sovereignty at the country level means can you produce enough food to feed yourselves instead of relying upon international trade? Um, it is really difficult to do that. I do not recommend, I have several papers. Dean, if you email me at my email address, which is mbrown52@UMD, I will send you a few papers that I've written about this, where there are both risks and opportunities for smallholder, low-income places, communities to use satellite data, and it is really challenging to understand or to provide sufficient investment to become food sovereign at the national level. But there are places that you can definitely have, there's definitely opportunities there. The last question, Waleed, when did you want? I have until quarter after. Is that correct? There's lots of questions. So here, I was intrigued by, you mentioned India still ranks low in adopting digital agronomy tools. Right, so this is where the individual farmer is using the digital agronomy tools. India is incredibly advanced in so many ways. For example, its crop insurance program and its use of satellite data to monitor production. What I think we meant by that is the ability of Indian farmers to afford to get access to all of the data that they would need to help them grow their own fields most productively. If you email me, I will send you that McKinsey report. I think that India is actually one of the most, has such an amazing, I wish the United States was good in investing in low cell phone and high data volume. They have an amazing data set of food prices and production. They, however, have a very, they have a lot of very poor farmers who cannot afford to spend the time putting in all their information and getting and using digital agronomy tools. So a lot more, I guess I would say is there's so much more opportunity there. But I'm happy to share that McKinsey report with you. Okay.
Molly,
Um, yeah,
there's other questions. We still have 1 minute. I just put in the chat. So the question is like, what are your thoughts on a remote sensing application to more economic, human-sided aspect? Oh, I think you answered this
yes,
question,
I
right?
answered that one also.
And you had another question about the accuracy of the maps. I mean, how accurate do you believe the country production estimate are?
Okay. So this is an excellent question that Mario, who is coming right up, will also talk about. So if you think about accuracy and precision, is in relation to an actual, like to a particular gold standard. Sadly, we don't really have a gold standard. So in each country, so Zimbabwe is a really interesting example because they have extremely accurate information about area planted because they have a fairly intact network of state-funded agronomists or extension agents who know in general the increase or decrease of production in a particular or area cultivated but they really don't know about yield though. So the total production is pretty uncertain, but their area cultivated. So they were interested in that particular Zimbabwe example is for us to peg our accuracy assessment to the FAO stats. Other countries want us to peg to the USDA or to their own information. So it is a constant challenge to relate the statistics we get from comprehensive bottom-up remote sensing production to something which the client says they think is the best available information for them, right? What we do not do in sixth grade is attempt to do a NASA style accuracy assessment where we spend more money on the validation and calibration and accuracy than we do on the initial data product itself, because it's just so challenging. So, but I'm sure that Mario is going to give us more information about that, and as well as Pete. So with
Okay.
that, I'm going to hand the baton over. Thank you so much, Waleed, for your help and support. Feel
Mhm.
free to email me. I can send you all slides if you want them. Okay?
Perfect. Thank you, Molly. Just a reminder, I'll put the form for people to be to keep informed on the upcoming news and the upcoming training. And sorry for the 3 minute late, Mario. And please go ahead and um, share your screen and let's start. Thank you so much.